Today's lecture is about the science of macroeconomics. We will focus on the science of macroeconomics. What is macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is concerned with the study of economy as a whole, or rather, it is the study of the whole economy. So, when economists are measuring the performance of the economy, they focus on macroeconomic variables. Now, there are many macroeconomic variables, of which the most important are real gross domestic product, the inflation rate, the unemployment rate. Now, what is GDP or gross domestic product? GDP is the total value of all final goods and services produced within the domestic boundary of a country within a given year. Now, this GDP can be measured, that is, there in two ways. One is nominal GDP and the other is the real GDP. Nominal GDP is when we measure the value of all goods and services produced in the country in a given year in terms of the prices prevailing in that year. While if we measure the GDP in terms of base year prices, that is adjusted for prices, that becomes the real gross domestic product. Next, we have another important macroeconomic variable, that is the inflation rate. What is inflation? Inflation means a sustained increase in price level over a period of time. And another important macroeconomic indicator is the unemployment rate. Now, this is a very important indicator which shows how the economy is performing. Unemployment means the portion of the people or the portion of the workforce that is without any work. So it measures the fraction of the labor force that is out of work. Now, there are different kinds of unemployment which we are not focusing on right now. So, for the time being, we are just saying that the three most important macroeconomic indicators used to measure the performance of an economy are real GDP, which measures the total income of everyone in the economy, adjusted for the level of prices in case of real GDP. Then we have the inflation rate, which measures how fast the prices are rising. And we have the unemployment rate, that is, it measures the fraction of the total population that is without work. So these three indicators basically show how the economy is performing. So obviously an economy is performing well means all these three indicators are doing well. That means the economy's real GDP is high, the inflation rate is low, and also the unemployment rate is low. Now, when macroeconomists, what do they when they are studying these variables, actually what do they focus on? So basically the macroeconomists study on, or they focus on, how these variables are determined, that is how to determine the real GDP, how to determine the inflation rate, how to determine the unemployment level. Then they also study how these variables and why these variables change over time, that is how GDP is changing over time, that is how it, whether it is rising or falling over time, and if so, why if it is rising, then why is the real GDP rising over time, or if the GDP is falling, why is it falling over time. Same for inflation and unemployment. If the economy is experiencing high unemployment level for a period of time, why is this happening, why is the unemployment level increasing. And next is they focus on how these variables interact with one another. That is, what is the relationship between these variables? That is, what is the relationship between GDP and unemployment level? What is the relationship between inflation and unemployment? This we can see on the basis of common sense only. We can say that when real GDP grows over time, that means the country's income is rising. That means all the residents of the country, they are enjoying a higher income level. So basically we can say that the average income level rises. So this will enable people to enjoy a higher standard of living. So they are now able to afford commodities which able to they are now able to afford to buy commodities which they were not able to do before, because now because of their higher income, because of their higher income level, they are able to purchase commodities which they were not able to do before. So when real GDP grows over time, we can say that people's income level is rising, or the average income level of the country is rising. So now people are able to consume more, they are able to buy more goods and commodities than they were able to before. lies in income. So we can say that during this period when real GDP is rising, the demand is the aggregate demand in the economy is also rising. Now, when the aggregate demand in the economy is rising, then that means the producers will start producing more. So, on the whole, the consumers as well as the producers, all of them are enjoying a higher level of income. Now, the reverse situation also happens. That is, when the real GDP is falling. So, these periods of time when the real GDP is falling, these periods are called recessions. If it is mild, if the fall is mild, but if the fall in real GDP is severe, then it is said the economy is going through a depression. So, obviously, if the periods of increased GDP, we can say that people are enjoying higher standards of living, and there is a period of economic prosperity. In the opposite scenario, when the real GDP is falling, then obviously that means the people's standard of living will be coming down. That means the whole country is now facing economic hardship, economic difficulties. So these periods of and then we can have another concept known as deflation. It is just the opposite of inflation. So while inflation means a period of sustained rise in prices, periods of sustained fall in prices are known as deflation. Now, if we focus on unemployment, obviously in an economy, the level of unemployment varies from year to year. So, if we focus on periods of recession and depression, normally it has been seen that these periods of recession and depression are associated with high level of unemployment. Now, why is that so? Now, this can be again, if we just focus on, suppose, let's focus on an economy which is going through a period of recession. That means that aggregate GDP is falling. Now, aggregate GDP is falling means people now have less income in their hands. Now, if they have less income in their hands, they will start purchasing less. They will buy less goods and services, and as they buy less goods and services, that means aggregate demand is falling. Now, if the aggregate demand in the economy falls, the producers will also reduce their output in response to that fall in demand. Now, if the producers produce less output, they will now require less labor for production of that output. So, obviously, this will result in high unemployment. So, from this only, we can say that recessions and depressions are normally associated with very high levels of unemployment. Now we'll discuss another concept called actual and potential output. Now, what is potential output? Potential output basically means the full employment level of output. That means the productive capacity of the economy when all the resources in the economy are fully utilized or fully employed. So, if we assume a hypothetical situation, that is when all the labor in the economy, all capital, all the resources in the economy are fully employed, then what is the maximum level of output that can be produced by the economy? That is known as full employment output or potential output. And again, we have the actual level of output, that is nothing but the total output actually produced by the economy in a particular period, say a period of 1 year, right? So this is the difference between the two concepts. Now, again, if we consider there's a question of inflation, that is, what is happening? Why is inflation taking place? Why are the prices rising continuously? So, the macroeconomics will focus on these parameters when they are measuring the performance of any economy. Now, when the macroeconomists are looking at the major macroeconomic indicators, that is, suppose real GDP and unemployment and inflation, they will also consider the relationship between these variables. So, first, if we consider, suppose the macroeconomists, they are focusing on the relationship between actual output and unemployment. So, if the macroeconomists collect data and they will find out, they have found out, this has happened, that there is or we can be said that the level of output is a function of employment. There is a total level of output produced in the economy will depend on the total level of employment. Now this is very obvious because in microeconomics, in production function, which has already been seen that the output level depends on that as the amount of output produced depends on the amount of number of laborers employed, that is L, and K, that is amount of capital employed. So the output produced is a function of labor and capital. This is in the micro level. The same thing will hold for macro level as well. If this production of output is dependent on the level of number of laborers employed in the micro level, that is for one particular firm, this will hold true for all the firms in the economy. So as a whole, we can say that for the economy, the actual level of output depends on or is a function of the level of employment. Again, if we consider the other two indicators of macroeconomic performance, like level of unemployment and inflation, macroeconomists have found that these two parameters, they are negatively related. That is, there is an inverse relationship between the level of unemployment and the rate of inflation. This has been mainly found out by or discovered by Phillips, who has studied the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and he has found that there is a negative relationship between the two. That is, if an economy wants to bring down the level of unemployment, it will have to bear a high level of inflation, and vice versa. If the economy wants to control the inflation, it will have to bear with high level of unemployment. So it is possible for the economy to bring both of them down. That is, to bring down both unemployment and inflation. If unemployment rises, that is, if inflation rises, unemployment will fall, and vice versa. So this negative relationship between inflation and unemployment has been captured by the Phillips curve, which is downward sloping. It is named after A.W. Phillips. It is named after Phillips, who has hypothesized or who has postulated that the relationship between inflation and unemployment is negative. So this Phillips curve captures the inverse relationship or the negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, which will be studied in details later. Now, one more thing is that the actual level of output is obviously regulated by the level of demand. So this is very obvious. Again, the level of demand coming from the economy, that will determine again the actual level of output. Obviously, because if the demand is less, the producers will cut back production. There is no point producing more output if the demand is less, because that output will not be sold, right? So accordingly, the producers determine the level of output after finding out the aggregate demand in the economy, or in other words, the actual level of output is regulated or determined by the level of demand. Now again, this level of demand is also strong in its turn strongly affected by the several monetary and fiscal policy measures taken by the government and the central bank. Suppose like money supply, government purchases, and tax rate. Now money supply, suppose it's a monetary policy instrument. Suppose the central bank decides to increase the supply of money in the economy. Now that means that people will have now more money in their hands. If people have more money in their hands, they will now start buying, or they will now start to demand more goods and services. So accordingly, the demand for goods and services will go up. Now the aggregate demand in the economy, we can say that the aggregate demand in the economy is composed of consumption demand coming from the households, the investment demand coming from the firms, and the government purchase of goods and services. Now, which way we can say the government demand for goods and services. So now this, if we denote the consumption demand coming from the households as C, the investment demand coming from the firms as I, and the government expenditure on goods and services as G, we can say that the aggregate demand in the economy, in short we can say AD, is equal to, or y equal to C plus I plus G. That is consumption demand plus investment demand plus government expenditure of goods and services. Now suppose the central bank decides to increase the supply of money in the economy. That will mean that people have more money in their hands. So accordingly, they will start demanding more goods and services. So aggregate demand in the economy will go up, because now see, consumption demand coming from the households is going up. Again, suppose tax rates. Now suppose government cuts down the tax rates. Then what will happen? If the government cuts down the tax rates or reduces the tax rate, the disposable income, what is disposable income? It is the difference between income and tax. That is the level of income retained by the household after payment of taxes to the government. So if we say that Y is the income earned by the household and T is the tax, then disposable income is nothing but Y minus T. That is the amount of income retained by the household after payment of taxes to the government. So now if the government reduces the tax rate, that means the disposable income with the household increases. So that is true for all the households. So accordingly, the household will start demanding more goods and services. So accordingly, consumption demand coming from the households will go up. As the consumption demand goes up, that means C, the total aggregate demand in the economy is nothing but C plus I plus G. That means if C is going up, I and G remaining the same, that means aggregate demand in the economy is increasing. So here we can see that this either monetary policy instrument like change in money supply, increase in money supply, or reduction of the tax rate, how these can affect the aggregate demand in the economy. Like in suppose government purchase of goods and services, that is suppose G. If suppose government decides to purchase more goods and services, then G goes up. Then again aggregate demand goes up. Then again, this again in this government can use these fiscal policy instruments, that is G and T tax rate, to uh, influence the level of aggregate demand in the economy. Same for money supply as well. Now, how do economists carry out their analysis? What do they do basically to analyze? So the first step they do is uh, they build a model based on the economic theory. So the economists they use models to understand the real world, to understand the relationship between the different economic variables, like we said, GDP, inflation, and unemployment. So basically, we can say that economic models illustrate the mathematical relationships among the different economic variables. One very good example is consumption function. Now, this is very common example because we can say that consumption of an individual very obviously depends on the individual's level of income. The consumption this is same for all the individuals. So for the economy as a whole, we can say that consumption depends on the level of income. So if we consider a particular household, we can say consumption of a household will depend on the income earned by that particular household. So we can say consumption depends on income. So in this case, models have been built by economists, which is called consumption function, to study the relationship between consumption and income, where it is stated that consumption is a function of income, and accordingly, a mathematical relationship has been built between them. Like C, if C we denote C for consumption and Y for income, it can be said that C is a function of income and C prime Y, that is DCDY, is positive. That is, if income rises, consumption will also rise, and vice versa. If income falls, consumption will fall. So there are different kinds of model, but if for the time being, we can say that models have basically two kinds of variables. One is endogenous variable, the other is exogenous variable. What is an endogenous variable? Or endo, the name itself, endo means inside. That is the variables which are determined from within the model. Those are known as endogenous variables. That is the variables which the model tries to explain basically. And exo means outside. So the variables which are determined from outside the model, they are known as exogenous variables. So these variables are already given from outside. The model accepts them as given. So basically, the purpose of the model is to determine to find out how the changes in exogenous variables impact the endogenous variables. So basically, the model shows the impact of the changes in exogenous variables on the different endogenous variables. For example, we can consider the model of supply and demand. Now, suppose one economist is interested in finding out the factors which influence the price of a commodity and the quantity of a commodity sold. What are the factors which determine the price of the commodity and the quantity produced of the commodity? So then the economist would develop a model that would describe the behavior of the buyers of the commodity and also the behavior of the sellers, and how the buyers and sellers are interacting in the market. So let's see how, for example, suppose the economist assumes that the quantity demanded of the commodity depends on the price of the commodity and the aggregate income. So in this case, the economist will write this relationship like this: quantity demanded QT depends on the price of the commodity and also on the income level. So QD is a D is a function of P, that is a price, and Y aggregate in the income level of aggregate income Y, and the price of the commodity P. So this is the demand function. So basically D represents the demand function, Similarly, again, the economist assumes that the quantity supplied by the producer, QS, will depend on the price of the commodity and also on the prices of the materials used, or the prices of raw materials used for producing the commodity. We can denote it by PM, suppose. So in this case, the supply function will look like this. QS is a function of QS equal to S is a function of P and PM, where P is the price of the product and PM is the prices of raw materials. So in this case, S represents the supply function. So after the economist has built up the demand function and the supply function, then he or she will assume that the prices of the commodity and the quantity, rather the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity produced is determined when the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. That means Q is equal to QD. That is, the market is clear. Supply is equal to demand. So these three equations, that is the demand function, the supply function, and this market clearing equation QS equal to QD, they will determine the model now, or rather the model is now comprises these three equations, we can say. So now again the model is represented by equations, and also diagrammatically the model can also be represented diagrammatically, like here. So here we have the economics can depict or we have depicted the demand curve and the supply curve. The demand curve is downward sloping, supply curve is upward rising. Now why is it so? The demand curve is downward sloping. Why? Because the higher price of the commodity will encourage the consumers to switch over to other commodities and buy less of the commodity whose price has gone up. So this is obviously, if the price of the commodity goes up, the consumers will switch over to substitutes available of the other substitutes available of the commodity in the market, and according to the quantity demanded will go down. So there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Higher the price level of the commodity, lower will be the quantity demanded, and vice versa. But again, the supply, that is why, because of this negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, the demand curve is downward sloping. On the other hand, we have the supply curve, which shows the relationship between the quantity of the commodity supplied and the price of the commodity. Now, the supply curve slopes upward. Why? Because there is a positive relationship between price and the price of the product and the quantity supplied. Why is this so? Because if the higher is the price of the product, that means that the sellers can now sell the product at higher prices. So now they will be able to earn higher profits. So the higher the prices, the more encouraged the sellers are to produce more of the product, to sell the product, to produce more product. So the higher the prices, the higher will be the supply. Conversely, the lower the price level, the producers will not be motivated enough to produce, because they will now get less price for their products, so their profit will come down. So when the price is less, the production quantity supplied will be less, and conversely, if the price is higher, the quantity supplied will also be higher. So this positive relationship between the price level and the quantity supplied is responsible for the supply curve to be upward rising. So here in the diagram we see the supply curve is upward rising because of this positive relationship between quantity supplied and price. So we have got the demand curve, we have got the supply curve, and we have seen how they look like. So while the demand curve is while the demand curve is downward sloping due to the negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, the supply curve is upward rising because of the positive relationship between price and the quantity supplied. Finally, the point at which the demand curve and the supply curve intersect each other, that determines the market equilibrium. That is, at this point, the demand is exactly equal to supply. Whatever quantity of output is supplied by the producers is exactly the quantity of output demanded by the consumers. So quantity supplied is exactly equal to quantity demanded at this point of market equilibrium. So in this case, that is the corresponding price, the price corresponding to the market equilibrium is the equilibrium price, and the quantity corresponding to the market equilibrium is the equilibrium quantity. So in this way, the economist has used this. We can say the economist has used this model to find out the equilibrium price and quantity in the market. So he or she has taken the help of the equations, that is the demand function, the supply function, and the market clearing equation, that is Q equal to QS, and this illustration to help find out the equilibrium price and quantity in the market. So at this price, the market clears. Quantity demanded is at this price and this quantity, the market clears. It is quantity demanded is exactly equal to the quantity supplied. So if we consider this model, now this model has two exogenous variables and two endogenous variables. Now what are the exogenous variables? The aggregate income and the price of the raw materials PM. So aggregate income Y and the price of the materials PM. So now because this model takes these two variables as given from outside, it does not make any attempt to explain the prices of the materials and the aggregate level of income. It just simply takes them as given. The endogenous variables of the model are the price of the commodity and the quantity of the commodity. So this we saw. It is this model helps to determine the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity are determined from within the model. So they are the endogenous variables as they determined within the model. So now, once these endogenous variables have been determined, now the model can be used to show how a change in one of the exogenous variables can have an impact on both one or both of the endogenous variables. Suppose let's focus the exogenous variables in this model are Y, that is aggregate income, and PM, that is prices of the raw materials. Suppose if the aggregate income increases, then what happens? That means people have more money in their hands, so they will now start demanding more goods and services. So then the demand for the commodity will rise. So in this case, equilibrium price and quantity, what will happen is this can be shown diagrammatically as well. In this case, the aggregate demand goes up, so supply curve remaining the same. The aggregate demand will now shift to the right, shift higher to the right, and this will reach the equilibrium quantity will increase, equilibrium price will also increase. So uh, this can be seen diagrammatically, which we will see later. So an increase in aggregate income will lead to an increase in both equilibrium price and quantity. Again, suppose the price of raw materials increases, then what will happen? Now, if the price of raw materials increases, that means production becomes more costly. So that means the profit of the producer will come down. So this will discourage the producers from producing more. So the producers will cut back production. So supply of the commodities will decrease. So in this case, what will happen? The supply curve will shift upwards because the producers will now cut back supply. So in this case, the quantity supplied will fall. In this case, this will be the supply curve. If the supply curve intersects the demand curve somewhere here, so this the supply curve will now shift upwards to the left. So the supply curve intersects the demand curve here. So the quantity will fall and the price will rise. So the equilibrium quantity, the quantity will once as the price of raw materials increases, the producers cut back supply. So the supply curve will shift upwards to the left. So it will intersect the demand curve at this point. We are not drawing it here. It can be drawn and shown. The supply curve will now pass through here, and it intersects the demand curve at this point. So price will So first the quantity will fall and the price will rise. So the equilibrium price of the commodity rises and the equilibrium quantity of the commodity falls. So this is just an example. So in this case, this is how the model that we can say that we see how the model shows that the changes in aggregate income or the price of raw materials can have an impact on the price and quantity, equilibrium price and quantity, this price and the quantity of the commodity produced, right? So this is the same for all the models normally. So this is what models do basically. They show how changes in the exogenous variables have an impact or how they impact the endogenous variables. So thus in this case we saw how changes in PM and Y will affect the price and quantity of them in the market, commodity market. Similarly, the same thing is done in other models as well. That is how changes in exogenous variables impact the endogenous variables. Now, normally models are based on some simplifying assumptions because obviously when we are focusing on it is basically the model is studying a macroeconomic phenomenon, and in the in the economy as a whole there are lots of factors which are interrelated with each other. So it is not possible to study all the interrelations at the same time because that will make the analysis extremely complicated. So what is done is basically some simplifying assumptions are made. Like some of the factors are kept fixed while the relationship between the other factors are studied, so that it is possible to understand the relationship between these two particular variables in a better way. Like suppose we are considered the if we go back to the example of consumption function, we said that consumption depend on the income level, right? So C is a function of Y. If C denotes consumption and Y denotes income, we can say C is a function of Y. But again, there are some simplifying assumptions in this model. It is assumed that no, that all other factors which can have an impact on consumption, those are not considered. They are considered fixed. Now, what are the factors which can have an impact on consumption apart from income? Like apart from the income level of a family, the size of the family has an impact on the consumption of the family as well. Like the family is having greater number, more children and more aged people, their consumption expenditure will be higher. Again, the place of residence of the family, if the urban families have typically have higher consumption expenditures compared to rural families. So size of the family, the larger the size of the family, the greater will be the consumption expenditure, and obviously smaller the size of the family, smaller the consumption expenditure. Age distribution of the family, that is families having greater number of aged people and children will have higher consumption expenditures. So the size of the family, the age distribution of the family, the place of residence of the family, these factors also have an impact on consumption expenditure of the family apart from income. But when we are studying the relationship between consumption expenditure and income, we assume that the rest of the factors, that is the family size, the age distribution, all these we consider as constant. We don't take them into the picture, because if all the factors are brought into the picture at the same time, it will make the analysis very complicated. So to simplify matters, the models are usually based on certain assumptions to present the real economy in a simplified way. So basically we can say the models are based on simplifying assumptions. So in this case, if we consider this demand supply model, this model does not take into account the factor that every producer is in a different location. Again, for each consumer, the location of one producer can be more convenient than the other. So even if the producer who is nearby to the consumer, even if he or she is charging more, the consumer can prefer that to traveling a huge distance and get a product at a lower price. Again, some producers have the ability to set their own prices. This is again considered in detail in the chapters which we'll be focusing on later. So these factors are not considered when in the model. So basically the model assumes that there is a single price of the commodity, but the fact is that every producer can charge a different price for the commodity. They're free to do that, subject to some restrictions, of course. So those factors are not taken into consideration in the model because they are going to make the analysis extremely complicated. So basically, in economics, it is very essential to judge which assumption is clarifying the model, more clarifying, and which assumption can be misleading. So basically, the model has to be constructed in such a way that it reflects the reality. At the same time, it does not become too complicated to understand. So accordingly, the model basically the simplified representation of the economy. It cannot represent the economy fully because, as I mentioned, that it is not possible to consider the interaction between all the different factors as it happens in the real economy, because that will make the analysis very complicated. So basically, simplification is necessary. At the same time, it has to be kept in mind that the crucial features of the economy, they are not need to be retained. If they are not considered, then obviously the model will not be a true representation of the economy. So the economic modeling therefore needs to be handled very carefully, keeping these factors in mind. Now, obviously, there are different models for studying different aspects of the economy, because one model cannot take care of all the issues which are faced by an economy. So, just like this, the macroeconomic, basically, we can say that macroeconomy is very wide. It's a We are looking at the economy as a whole, all the economy wide aggregates. So. Economists also use different kind of models to address all these macroeconomic issues. So basically, there is no one single model which can address all these issues. There are different models that address different aspects of the economy. There's another important concept, that is flexible versus sticky prices. Normally, the economists assume that whenever there is an imbalance in the economy, the price of the good or service will move quickly to bring about equality of quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So they assume that the market goes into equilibrium whenever any instability arises, the market quickly clears. This assumption is called market clearing. Uh, but it is this assumption of continuous clearing of the market is not very realistic, because for markets to clear instantly or continuously, the prices need to adjust immediately to change in supply and demand. But it rarely happens in reality. Basically, money and wages and prices, they adjust very slowly. When labor contracts are signed normally for a period of 3 years, suppose, then wages will remain fixed for a period of 3 years. They can change only after a period of 3 years. Again, there are many firms which leave their product prices the same for a long periods of time, so that they don't lose customers. So all these factors are there. So while market clearing models assume that all the wages and prices are flexible, in the real world, actually they may not be that flexible. They may be sticky. Some wages and prices are sticky, that is, they remain fixed. Now, but that this doesn't mean that the market clearing models have become useless, because over a period of time the prices will change. They will adjust to supply and demand. So basically, the macroeconomists believe that price flexibility helps to study long run phenomena, that is, the growth of real GDP over a decade. So that is more, in that case, price flexibility is more helpful. But for studying short run issues like year to year fluctuations of real GDP or year to year variations in the unemployment, then it is better to assume that the prices are fixed. So normally over short periods of time, many prices are assumed as fixed. Therefore, basically, most of the macroeconomists believe that price stickiness is better for studying economic behavior in the short run, while price flexibility is better for studying the economic behavior in the long run. That's all for today. Thank